Dogma, the Fellowcraft. In the ancient Orient, all religion was more or less a mystery, and there was no divorce from it of philosophy. The popular theology, taking the multitude of allegories and symbols for realities, denigrated into a worship of the celestial luminaries, of imaginary deities with human feelings, passions, appetites, and lusts, of idols, stones, animals, and reptiles. The onion was sacred to the Egyptians because its different layers were a symbol of the concentric heavenly spheres. Of course, the popular religion could not satisfy the deeper longings and thoughts, the loftier aspirations of the spirit, or the logic of reason. The first, therefore, was taught to the initiated in the mysteries. There also it was taught by symbols. The vagueness of symbolism, capable of many interpretations, reached what the palpable and conventional creed could not. Its indefiniteness acknowledged the obtuseness of the subject. It treated that mystery's subject mystically. It endeavored to illustrate what it could not explain, to excite an appropriate feeling. If it could not develop an adequate idea, and to make the image a mere subordinate conveyance for the conception, which itself never became obvious or familiar. Thus the knowledge now imparted by books and letters was of old conveyed by symbols, and the priests invented or perpetuated a display of rites and exhibitions which were not only more attractive to the eye than words, but more suggestive and more pregnant with meaning to the mind. Masonry, successor of the mysteries, still follows the ancient manner of teaching. Her ceremonies are like the ancient mystic shows, not the reading of an essay, but the opening of a problem, requiring research and constituting philosophy, the arch expounder. Her symbols are the instruction she gives. The lectures are endeavors, often partial and one-sided, to interpret these symbols. He who would become an accomplished Mason must not be content merely to hear, or even to understand, the lectures. He must, aided by them, and they having, as it were, marked out the way for him, study, interpret, and develop these symbols for himself. Though Masonry is identical with the ancient mysteries, it is so only in this qualified sense, that it presents but an imperfect image of their brilliance, the ruins only of their grandeur, and a system that has experienced progressive alterations, the fruits of social events, political circumstances, and the ambitious imbecility of its improvers. After leaving Egypt, the mysteries were modified by the habits of the different nations among whom they were introduced, and especially by the religious systems of the countries into which they were transplanted. To maintain the established government, laws, and religion was the obligation of the initiate everywhere, and everywhere they were the heritage of the priests, who were nowhere willing to make the common people co-proprietors with themselves of philosophical truth. Masonry is not the Colosseum in ruins. It is rather a Roman palace of the Middle Ages, disfigured by modern architectural improvements, yet built on a Cyclopean foundation laid by the Etruscans, and with many a stone of the superstructure taken from dwellings and temples of the age of Hadrian and Antoninus. Christianity taught the doctrine of fraternity, but repudiated that of political equality by continually inculcating obedience to Caesar and to those lawfully in authority. Masonry was the first apostle of equality. In the monastery, there is fraternity and equality, but no liberty. Masonry added that also, and claimed for man the threefold heritage: liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was but a development of the original purpose of the mysteries, which was to teach men to know and practice their duties to themselves and their fellows, the great practical end of all philosophy and all knowledge. Truths are the springs from which duties flow, and it is but a few hundred years since a new truth began to be distinctly seen, that man is supreme over institutions and not they over him. Man has natural empire over all institutions. They are for him, according to his development, not he for them. This seems to us a very simple statement, one to which all men everywhere ought to assent. But once it was a great new truth, not revealed until the governments had been in existence for at least 5,000 years. Once revealed, it imposed new duties on men. Man owed it to himself to be free. He owed it to his country to seek to give her freedom, or maintain her in that possession. It made tyranny and usurpation the enemies of the human race. It created a general outcry of despots and despotism, temporal and spiritual. The sphere of duty was immensely enlarged. Patriotism had, henceforth, a new and wider meaning. Free government, free thought, free conscience, free speech. All these came to be inalienable rights, which those who had parted with them or had been robbed of them, or whose ancestors had lost them, had the right summarily to retake. Unfortunately, as truths always become perverted into falsehoods, and are falsehoods when misapplied, this truth became the gospel of anarchy soon after it was first preached. Masonry early comprehended this truth and recognized its own enlarged duties. Its symbols then came to have a wider meaning, but it also assumed the mask of stonemasonry and borrowed its working tools and was so supplied with new and apt symbols. It aided in bringing about the French Revolution, disappeared with the Giordanists, was born again with the restoration of order, and instituted Napoleon because, through emperor, he acknowledged the right of the people to select its rulers, and was at the head of a nation refusing to receive back its old kings. He pleaded with saber, musket, and cannon, the great cause of the people against royalty, the right of the French people even to make a Corsican general their emperor if it pleased them. Masonry felt that this truth had the omnipotence of God on its side, and that neither pope nor potentate could overcome it. It was a truth dropped into the world's wide treasury, and forming a part of the heritage which each generation receives, enlarges, and holds in trust, and of necessity bequeaths to mankind, the personal estate of man, entailed of nature to the end of time. And Masonry early recognized it as a truth that is set forth and developed. A truth, or any human excellence of gift or growth, is to make greater the spiritual glory of the race, that whosoever aids the march of a truth and makes the thought a thing, writes in the same line with Moses and with him who died upon the cross, and has an intellectual sympathy with the deity himself. The best gift we can bestow on man is manhood. It is that which Masonry is ordained of God to bestow on its votaries, not sectarianism and religious dogma, not a rudimental morality that may be found in the writings of Confucius, Zoroaster, Seneca, and the rabbis, in the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, not a little and cheap common school knowledge, but manhood in science and philosophy. Not that philosophy or science is in opposition to religion, for philosophy is but that knowledge of God and the soul, which is derived from the observation of the manifested action of God and the soul, and from a wise analogy. It is the intellectual guide which the religious sentiment needs. The true religious philosophy of an imperfect being is not a system of creed, but as Socrates thought, an infinite search or approximation. Philosophy is that intellectual and moral progress which the religious sentiment inspires and ennobles. As to science, it could not walk alone while religion was stationary. It consists of those matured inferences from experience which all other experience confirms. It realizes and unites all that was truly valuable in both the old schemes of mediation, one heroic, or the system of action and effort, and the mystical theory of spiritual, contemplative communion. Listen to me, says Galen, as to the voice of the Eleusinian Hierophant, and believe that the study of nature is a mystery no less important than theirs, nor less adapted to display the wisdom and power of the great Creator. Their lessons and the demonstrations were obscure, but ours are clear and unmistakable. We deem that to be the best knowledge we can obtain of the soul of another man, which is furnished by his actions and his lifelong conduct. Evidence to the contrary, supplied by what another man informs us that this soul has said to his, would weigh little against the former. The first scriptures for the human race were written by God on the earth and heavens. The readings of these scriptures is science. Familiarity with the grass and trees, the insects, and the infusoria teaches us deeper lessons of love and faith than we can glean from the writings of Finlan and Augustine. The great Bible of God is ever open before mankind. Knowledge is convertible into power, and axioms into rules of utility and duty. But knowledge itself is not power. Wisdom is power, and her prime minister is justice, which is the perfected law of truth. The purpose, therefore, of education and science is to make a man wise. If knowledge does not make him so, it is wasted like water poured on the sands. To know the formulas of Masonry is of little value by itself, as to know so many words and sentences in some barbarous African or Australian dialect. To know even the meaning of the symbols is but little unless that adds to our wisdom, and also to our charity, which is to justice like one hemisphere of the brain to the other. Do not lose sight, then, of the true object of your studies in Masonry. It is to add to your estate of wisdom and not merely to your knowledge. A man may spend a lifetime in studying a single specialty of knowledge, botany, conchology, or entomology, for instance, in committing to memory names derived from the Greeks and classifying and reclassifying, and yet be no wiser than when he began. It is the great truths as to all that most concerns a man, as to his rights, interests, and duties, that Masonry seeks to teach her initiates. The wiser a man becomes, the less he will be inclined to submit tamely to the imposition of fetters or a yoke on his conscience or his person. For, by increase of wisdom, he not only better knows his rights, but the more highly values them, and is more conscious of his worth and dignity. His pride then urges him to assert his independence. He becomes better able to assert it also, and better able to assist others or his country, when they or she stake all, even existence, upon the same assertion. But mere knowledge makes no one independent, nor fits him to be free. It often only makes him a more useful slave. Liberty is a curse to the ignorant and brutal. Political science has for its object to ascertain in what manner or by means of what institutions political and personal freedoms may be secured and perpetuated, not license or the mere right of every man to vote, but entire and absolute freedom of thought and opinion, alike free from the despotism of monarch and mob and prelate, freedom of action within the limits of the general law enacted for all, the courts of justice with impartial judges and juries open to all alike, weakness and poverty equally potent in those courts as power and wealth, the avenues of office and honor open alike to all the worthy, the military powers in war or in peace, in strict subordination to the civil power, arbitrary arrest for acts not known to the law as crimes impossible. Romish inquisitions, star chambers, military commissions unknown, the means of instruction within reach of the children of all, the right of free speech and accountability of public officers, civil and military. If Masonry needed to be justified for imposing political as well as moral duties of its initiates, it would be enough to point to the sad history of the world. It would not even need that she should turn back the pages of history to the chapters written by Tacitus, that she should recite the incredible horrors of despotism under Caligula and Domitian, Caracalla and Commodus, Vitellius and Maximin. She need only to point to the centuries of calamity through which the gay French nation passed, to the long oppression of the feudal ages of the selfish Bourbon kings, to those times when the peasants were robbed and slaughtered by their own lords and princes, like sheep, when the lord claimed the first fruits of the peasant's marriage bed, when the captured city was given up to merciless rape and massacre, when the state prisons groaned with innocent victims, and the church blessed the banners of the pitiless murderers and sang Te-Deums for the crowning mercy of the eve of St. Bartholomew. We might turn over the pages to a later chapter, that of the reign of the 15th Louis, when the young girls, hardly more than children, were kidnapped to serve his lusts. When letters de cachet filled the Bastille with prisons accused of no crimes, with husbands who were in the way of their pleasure, of lascivious wives, and of villains wearing orders of nobility. When the people were ground between the upper and nether millstones of taxes, customs, and excises, and when the Pope's nuncio and Cardinal de la Roche-Aymon, devoutly kneeling, one on each side of the Madame de Berry, the king's abandoned prostitute put the slippers on her naked feet as she rose from the adulterous bed. Then, indeed, suffering and toil were the two forms of man, and the people were but beasts of burden. The true Mason is he who labors strenuously to help his order effect its great purpose. Not that the order can effect them by itself, but that it too can help. It also is one of God's instruments. It is a force and a power, and shame upon it if it did not exert itself, and, if need be, sacrifice his children in the cause of humanity, as Abraham were ready to offer up Isaac on the altar of sacrifice. It will not forget that noble allegory of Curtis, leaping all in armor into the great yawning gulf that opened to swallow Rome. It will try. It shall not be its fault if the day never comes when man will no longer have to fear a conquest and an invasion, a usurpation, a rivalry of nations with the armored hand, an interpretation of civilization depending upon marriage royal or a birth into hereditary tyrannies, a partition of the peoples by a congress, a dismemberment by the downfall of a dynasty, a combat of two religions meeting head to head, like two goats of darkness on the bridge in the infinite, when they will no longer have to fear famine, spoliation, prostitution from distress, misery from lack of work, and all the brigands of chance in the forest of events, when nations will gravitate about the truth like stars about the light, each in its own orbit, without clashing or collision, and everywhere freedom, censured with the stars, crowned with that celestial splendors, and with wisdom and justice on either hand, will reign supreme. In your studies as a Fellowcraft, you must be guided by reason, love, and faith. We do not now discuss the differences between reason and faith, and undertake to define the dominion of each. But it is necessary to say that even in the ordinary affairs of life, we are governed far more by what we believe than what we know, by faith and analogy than by reason. The age of reason of the French Revolution taught, we know, what a folly it is to enthrone reason by itself as supreme. Reason is at fault when it deals with the infinite. There we must revere and believe, notwithstanding the calamities of the virtuous, the miseries of the deserving, the prosperity of tyrants, and the murder of martyrs. We must believe there is a wise, just, merciful, and loving God, an intelligence and a providence supreme over all, and caring for the minutest things and events. A faith is a necessity to man. Woe to him who believes nothing. We believe that the soul of another is of a certain nature and possesses certain qualities. That is, he is generous and honest, or penurious and knavish, and that she is virtuous and amiable, or vicious and ill-tempered. From the countenance alone, from little more than a glimpse of it without the means of knowing, we venture our fortune on the signature of a man on the other side of the world whom we never saw, upon the belief that he is honest and trustworthy. We believe that occurrences have taken place upon the assertion of others. We believe that one will acts upon another, and in the reality of a multitude of other phenomena that reason cannot explain. But we ought not to believe what reason authoritatively denies, that at which the sense of right revolts, that which is absurd or self-contradictory, or at issue with experience or science, or that which degrades the character of the deity and would make him revengeful, malignant, cruel, or unjust. A man's faith is as much his own as his reason is. His freedom consists as much in his faith being free as in his will being uncontrolled by power. All the priests and augurs of Rome or Greece had not the right to require Cicero or Socrates to believe in the absurd mythology of the vulgar. All the imams and Mohammedans must have the right to require a pagan to believe that Gabriel dictated the Quran to the prophet. All the Brahmins that ever lived, if assembled in one conclave like the cardinals, could not gain a right to compel a single human being to believe in the Hindu cosmogony. No man or body of men can be infallible and authorized to decide what other men shall believe, as to any tenet of faith. Except to those who first receive it, every religion and the truth of all inspired writings depend on human testimony and internal evidences to be judged of by reason and the wise analogies of faith. Each man must necessarily have the right to judge of their truth for himself, because no one man can have any higher or better right to judge than another of equal information and intelligence. Domitian claimed to be the Lord God, and statues and images of him in silver and gold were found throughout the known world. He claimed to be regarded as the God of all men, and according to Suetonius, believed his letters thus: "Our Lord and God commands that it should be done, and so, and formally decreed that no one should address him otherwise, either in writing or by word of mouth." Porphyrius Sura, the philosopher who was his chief delator, accusing those who refused to recognize his divinity, however much he may have believed in that divinity, had not the right to demand that a single Christian in Rome or the province should do the same. Reason is far from being the only guide in morals or in political science. Love or loving kindness must keep it company to exclude fanaticism, intolerance, and persecution, to all of which a morality too aesthetic and extreme political principles invariably lead. We must also have faith in ourselves and in our fellows and in the people, or we shall be easily discouraged by reverse and our ardor cooled by obstacles. We must not listen to reason alone. Force comes more from faith and love, and it is by the aid of these that man scales the loftiest heights of morality or becomes the savior and redeemer of a people. Reason must hold the helm, but these supply the motivative power. They are the wings of the soul. Enthusiasm is generally unreasoning, and without it, and love and faith, there would have been no Rienzi or Tell or Sidney or any other of the great patriots whose names are immortal. If the deity had been merely and only all-wise and almighty, he would never have created the universe. It is genius that gets power, and its prime lieutenants are force and wisdom. The unruliest of men bend before the leader that has the sense to see and the will to do. It is genius that rules with godlike power, that unveils with its counselors the hidden human mysteries, cuts asunder with its word the huge knots, and builds up with its word the crumbled ruins. At its glance fall down the senseless idols, whose altars have been on all the high places and in all the sacred groves. Dishonesty and imbecility stand abashed before it. Its single yea or nay revokes the wrongs of ages, and is heard among the future generations. Its power is immense, because its wisdom is immense. Genius is the sun of the political sphere. Force and wisdom, its ministers, are the orbs that carry its light into darkness, and answer it with their solid reflecting truth. Development is symbolized by the use of the mallet and chisel. The development of the energies and intellect of the individual and the people. Genius may place itself at the head of an unintelligent, uneducated, unenergetic nation, but in a free country, to cultivate the intellect of those who elect is the only mode of securing intellect and genius for rulers. The world is seldom ruled by the great spirits, except after dissolution and new birth. In periods of transition and convulsion, the long parliaments, the Robespierres and Marats, and the seeming respectabilities of intellect too often hold the reins of power. The Cromwells and Napoleons come later. After Marius and Sulla and Cicero, the rotisserie Caesar. The great intellect is often too sharp for the granite of his life. Legislators may be very ordinary men, for legislation is very ordinary work, but it is the final issue of a million minds. The power of the purse or the sword compared to that of the spirit is poor and contemptible. As to lands, you may have agrarian law and equal partition, but a man's intellect is all his own, held direct from God and inalienable fief. It is the most potent of weapons in the hands of a paladin. If the people comprehend force in the physical sense, how much more do they reverence the intellectual? Ask Hildebrand or Luther or Loya. They fall prostrate before it, as before an idol. The master of mind over mind is the only conquest worth having. The other injures both and dissolves at a breath. Rude as it is, the great cable falls down and snaps at last. But this dimly resembles the dominion of the Creator. It does not need a subject like that of Peter the Hermit. If the stream be but bright and strong, it will sweep like a spring tide to the popular heart. Not in word only, but in intellectual act lies the fascination. It is the homage to the invisible. This power knotted with love is the golden chain let down into the well of truth, or the invisible chain that binds the rank of mankind together.